Hello, my name is Melissa Golding, and I'm the press officer for the Group of 30. I'd like to welcome all of you to today's live press conference and webinar launch of the G30's new research report, Carbon Pricing and Markets, Enabling Efficient Emission Reductions. We will begin the webinar with opening remarks from the chair of the Group of 30's Working Group on Carbon Pricing and Markets, Lord Adair Turner. Lord Turner will be followed by Project Director James Davis. After Mr. Davis makes his remarks, two members of the steering committee of the G30 Working Group on Carbon Pricing and Markets, Zhou Xiaochuan and Maria Ramos, will contribute their interventions. After the formal remarks, Adair Turner and James Davis will address audience questions. Please note that this report and presentation represent the views and recommendations of the Group of 30's Working Group on Carbon Pricing and Markets, and not the Group of 30 as a whole. While the report reflects broad agreement among the Working Group's participants, this does not imply agreement on every specific observation or nuance. Working Group members and the project directors participated in their personal capacities, and their participation does not imply the support or agreement of their respective public or private institutions. Today's speakers are likewise participating solely in their personal capacities. We will begin a roundtable Q&A discussion immediately following the formal remarks. I'd now like to introduce Adair Turner, Chair of the G30 Working Group on Carbon Pricing and Markets. Lord Turner?
Thank you, Melissa, and thank you everyone for joining us today. The Group of 30 launched our working group on carbon pricing and markets this time last year, and many of our G30 members beyond that working group have also contributed to crafting the conclusions and recommendations we're about to share. I would like in particular to thank the steering committee members, Maria Ramos, Ernesto Zedillo, and Zhou Xiaochuan, and the working group members whom you can see here, Thomas Burbel, Roger Ferguson, Arminio Fraga, Helen Ray, Tarman Shammugaratnam, and Yi Gang. And after we have presented the overall conclusions of the report, Maria and Zhou Xiaochuan will give their perspective. Additionally, the report would not have been possible without our excellent partnership with Oliver Wyman. So a big thank you to project advisor John Colas and project directors James Davis, Amruta Kelkar, and Ayub Abi Rafa for their support in the working group throughout the last year. The report starts with the scientific fact that man-made emissions of greenhouse gas emissions are causing global warming, which has already reached 1.5 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial levels and will go above 2 degrees centigrade if we do not reduce emissions soon and fast. And that will cause huge harm to human welfare. Now, that reality and the global consensus that all countries must take actions to address it is, of course, being challenged by the current US administration. But that doesn't change the scientific facts. And it is therefore essential to identify how to reduce emissions in the most efficient, least cost way possible. This report assesses two ways in which carbon pricing and carbon markets can do that. First, by applying carbon prices to some specific sectors of the economy. Second, by encouraging trade in carbon credits and in particular in carbon removal credits. I will present our conclusions on the first of those. James will talk to the second. The overall case for carbon pricing as a means to address the economic externality of climate change is, of course, well understood. And over the years, many mainstream economists have argued that carbon pricing, ideally applied across all sectors and countries, should be a primary instrument to achieve emissions reductions at least cost. That philosophy was reflected in the European Emissions Trading Scheme, which required companies in the power and industry sectors to compete for a limited and gradually declining supply of allowable emissions. And the EU ETS is now setting carbon prices high enough to have a major influence on company decisions. But Europe today is the only region with a widely applicable carbon price high enough to make a real difference. And it is notable that in many countries and sectors, other policy levers have so far played a more significant role in driving decarbonisation. The overall global policy framework agreed at the Paris conference in 2015, for instance, does not include any sort of commitment to globally agreed carbon pricing, but instead requires countries to make voluntary commitments to reduce emissions and then leaves it to each country to decide the policies to achieve that. And in most countries, policy levers other than explicit carbon pricing have so far played the more significant role, including, for instance, explicit subsidies for the first high-cost generations of new technologies such as solar PV or electric vehicles, direct regulations which require power companies to reduce the carbon intensity of electric generation or require automotive manufacturers to reduce the average emissions per kilometre travelled of the vehicles they are selling, and hard backstop regulations such as setting dates beyond which the sale of internal combustion engines will be prohibited, 2025 as it happens in Norway, 2030 in the UK, 2035 in the EU. This extensive reliance on non-price policy levers in part reflects the difficulty of achieving political consensus for widespread carbon pricing. But it is important to recognise that in some sectors, non-price policy levers may actually be optimal. There are, we suggest in the report, 5 factors which determine the relative merits of carbon pricing versus other policy levers in different sectors of the economy. First, how large energy costs are as a percentage of total costs. The larger that percentage, the more powerful carbon prices will be. Second, whether decisions about investments or alternative technologies are made by professional managers in companies who are likely to pay attention to a carbon price, or by individuals in residential homes. In the latter case, relying on a price mechanism may be less effective. Third, whether getting to net zero will have significant distributional consequences, as is, for instance, in the case in the shift from gas boilers to heat pumps in residential heating. The bigger the distributional challenges, the more we should be wary of relying on carbon prices as the sole or primary policy lever. Fourth, whether we already know with high probability the best decarbonisation technology. In the case of road transport, the answer is yes, and it is electric. In the case of iron and steel, there are many alternative routes to zero emissions, and a carbon price could help guide the choice between them. Fifth and finally, whether these technologies are already or soon will be cheaper than the old fossil fuel alternatives. Again, that is true already for electric vehicles, but not true and may never be true for aviation fuels. These criteria together imply that there are many applications, such as road transport, building heating, air conditioning, electric appliances in general, where non-price policies may be more effective and in some cases fairer than relying on carbon prices alone. But those 5 criteria also imply that carbon pricing will be the optimal policy and indeed almost a necessary policy in what are sometimes called the hard-to-abate sectors of the economy. Heavy industry such as iron and steel, cement and chemicals, and long-distance aviation and shipping. These sectors together account for about 26% of all energy-related and industrial process CO2 emissions. And the good news is that we do already know technologies which could achieve decarbonisation in these sectors at low cost to consumers and to the overall economy. But we also know that in these sectors there will be, perhaps forever, a significant green cost premium at the business-to-business level, with the cost of a ton of steel or shipping freight rates likely to rise significantly if produced in a zero carbon fashion. And that means that decarbonisation will not occur in these sectors without either carbon pricing or equivalent regulation. And in these sectors too, we do have professional decision makers managing energy costs, which are a high percentage of total cost, and making choices between several alternative decarbonisation technologies. And all of those characteristics lead to the report conclusion that carbon pricing must play a major role in enabling and encouraging decarbonisation of these hard to abate sectors. We also conclude that for these sectors, the ideal solution would be globally agreed carbon prices set at roughly the same level across the world, because another defining feature of these sectors is that they are either inherently international in nature, i.e., international shipping and international aviation, or extensively internationally traded, for instance, in the case of iron and steel. And we therefore applaud the steps which the International Maritime Organization took in April this year towards a global carbon price for shipping. But we note that in the heavy industry sectors, if one country or region alone introduces carbon prices and others do not, we will not actually achieve decarbonisation, but simply a shift of production to where carbon pricing is lowest or entirely absent. Countries or regions which go ahead with carbon prices before others, such as the European Union, must therefore legitimately introduce some form of carbon tariff, such as the EU Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, the CBAM. And the report argues that these are not protectionist, and indeed that they are the only way for developed countries to take responsibility, as they should, for the emissions embedded in goods imported from elsewhere. The report therefore urges major developing countries not to oppose the principle of CBAMs, but instead to respond by themselves introducing carbon prices to drive decarbonisation of their own domestic heavy industry sectors. If that did occur, of course, any tariff revenues arising from the CBAM would eventually disappear, with the developing countries instead gaining tax or auction revenues from domestic carbon pricing. That indeed is the deliberate and openly stated intent of the EU ETS, not to raise revenue, but to create an incentive for other countries to adopt carbon prices. And in a report, we therefore propose an additional policy which would make the non-protectionist intent of CBAMs absolutely clear, which is that some of the revenue which arises from any CBAM, whether imposed soon by Europe or in future by China or by India, should be committed to providing finance to support decarbonisation or climate adaptation in the world's poorest and most vulnerable countries. To sum up, therefore, our section on carbon pricing makes 5 recommendations. First, countries should use carbon pricing as the primary driver of decarbonisation in the hard-to-abate sectors. Second, such carbon pricing should ideally be imposed at common level across countries. Third, if internationally coordinated carbon pricing is impossible, countries or groups of countries that proceed with domestic carbon prices before others will need to impose carbon border adjustment mechanism. Fourth, major developing countries, for example, China and India, should respond to the EU's CBAM by introducing significant carbon prices in their own heavy industry sectors. Fifth and finally, that some of the proceeds from either global carbon prices, such as the one on shipping, or from CBAMs, should be devoted to supporting mitigation and adaptation in the lowest income countries most vulnerable to climate change. And with that, let me hand back to Melissa.
Thank you very much, Lord Turner. I'd now like to turn it over to James Davis, Project Director.
Thank you. This section discusses project-based carbon credits. That is, carbon credits that help fund projects that aim to reduce emissions or to remove carbon from the atmosphere. The first point we address in the report is the need for carbon removals. It is widely accepted that to limit global temperature increases below 2 degrees, a significant level of carbon removals will be needed alongside efforts to reduce emissions from human activities. How much is, of course, subject to debate. The optimal balance between gross emissions reductions and carbon removals depends on their relative costs, which will evolve as technologies develop. However, it is clear that a significant scale of CDRs or carbon removals, likely on the order of 2 to 4 gigatons per year in the 2030s, will be required to keep atmospheric CO2 within safe limits for our planet. As we continue to fall behind in reducing emissions from human activities, the need for carbon removal becomes ever more critical. This raises the important question of who should pay for projects that remove carbon from the atmosphere. Philanthropy has played a role, but is too small to be a large part of the answer. Development banks have an important role to play, but the bulk must fall with governments or corporates. The good news is that significant investment has been flowing into carbon removal projects. Our analysis looked at around $32 billion of investment over recent years, of which around 65% has been allocated to engineered removals, such as direct air capture, or BECCS, that require significant capital outlays to cover the costs of construction of capture equipment, transportation facilities, and storage sites. The remaining 35% has been invested in nature-based solutions, which are typically less capital intensive. The bad news is that the level of investment still falls well short of the levels required. The IEA projects that by 2030, on the current stated policy scenario, a scale up of around 20 to 40 times would be necessary to build capacity in the 2 to 4 gigaton range. Around half of the investment to date has come from private capital, and growing this will be critical for the market. And private capital requires a return. This is where carbon credits come in. The sale of carbon credits creates the revenue stream that can provide the return on capital invested. And so the critical challenge facing the market today is how to scale up demand for these credits. Without a clear revenue stream from the sale of carbon credits, it's impossible to attract investors and lenders to fund the capital outlays required to develop carbon removal projects. Yet voluntary purchase of project-based carbon credits by corporates deliver no direct private return. The buyer pays a price to the provider to reduce emissions, and the buyer only benefits if this enhances their reputation. At present, there is no formal recognition of the social value of such purchases and no standard language to describe it, with no agreed use on terms such as net zero or carbon neutral. Addressing this is then a critical part of the recommendations. We believe a differentiated approach across industries reflecting their fundamentally different economic characteristics is necessary in designing policy interventions to scale demand. For low-emitting sectors, such as financial services, technology, or professional services, the cost of buying carbon credits to cover their emissions is relatively low compared to their overall revenues and profits. So they have the potential to play a leading role if they see strong reputational benefits from these purchases. For these sectors, therefore, we call for clearer recognition of credits purchased by corporates within transition plans and emissions reporting frameworks by regulators and industry standard-setting bodies. Corporates today are required to disclose their emissions by either local laws or by exchange listing requirements in many major economies. Yet carbon removal purchases cannot be netted against these emissions. So the G30 believes that standard setters should offer more reputational incentives for companies that not only establish credible pathways to reduce emissions, but also commit to using carbon credits to offset some or all of the so-called area under the curve of their decreasing emissions. These standards will be more effective if they are also included in regulatory reporting requirements and audited accounting standards. For high-emitting sectors, a clear link to mandatory carbon price regimes is likely required. The economic costs of buying carbon credits are likely too high to be motivated voluntarily. This would mean companies being able to purchase CDR credits in order to meet their obligations under emissions trading schemes. This would not only expand the demand base into a wider set of actors, it would also increase the certainty of demand, a critical concern for investors and financiers. As well as providing direct demand for credits, this would signal legitimacy to the market, helping to establish a reference price. And this step is already being considered in some markets. For example, in the EU ETS, the regulator is already assessing a potential introduction and is expected to decide by July 2026. Singapore already allows companies to use international carbon credits to offset up to 5% of their taxable emissions. The discussion so far has focused on removal credits, yet the bulk of the project-based carbon market today is made up of reduction or avoidance credits. The difference between these two credits are as follows. The purchase of carbon removals result in actual negative emissions. By contrast, the purchase of non-removal credits is designed to result in a lower level of emissions than would otherwise have occurred. Such reductions might result from, for instance, buying credits to help finance renewable electricity developments, or paying landowners to take actions that would avoid deforestation. These types of credits have been subject to extensive scrutiny, especially around whether they are truly additional. That is, reducing carbon in a way that wouldn't have been economically viable otherwise. The report argues that specific categories of reduction credit can play a crucial reductions. The report highlights the accelerated closure of coal-fired power plants as one example. They can also help scale the market for project-based carbon credits by providing a pathway for corporates to enter the market and by supporting the development of market infrastructure. In line with the Oxford Principles for Net Zero Aligned Carbon Offsets, companies purchasing carbon credits should shift towards an increasing percentage of removals over time, reaching 100% in the long term. Another key area of focus is the need to further enhance supply-side integrity across all project-based markets. The G30 recommends such as those from the ICVCM into domestic policy and regulation to help address other key challenges around standards, essentially quality criteria for carbon credits and ensuring double counting is avoided. Furthermore, developing risk management solutions for uncertainties such as project failures will be helpful in building trust and encouraging participation in the carbon credit market. Considering the potential to link project-based markets to compliance markets. The risk of watering down compliance markets can be managed by limiting the use of credits to a small % of total current emissions, strong integrity, quality, and permanent standards. So to recap, the G30 make 6 recommendations. First of all, significant investments in carbon dioxide removal is essential to meet net zero targets. Secondly, specific categories of reduction credit can also play a crucial initial role, but companies purchasing carbon credits should shift towards the purchase of removals over time. Thirdly, enhancing supply-side integrity across all project-based markets is crucial. Fourthly, including CDRs in compliance schemes is an important additional mechanism to support the scaling of CDR. Fifthly, standard setters should offer more reputational incentives for companies that not only establish credible pathways, but also commit to using carbon credits to offset their decreasing emissions. And finally, sectors such as technology, financial institutions, and professional services can play an important role in scaling CDR and reduction credit markets if given clearer guidance on how credits can be used. And with that, let me hand back to Melissa.
Thank you very much, Ms. We will now hear from Dr. Zhou, member of the G30 Working Group on Carbon Pricing and Markets. Dr. Zhou?
Okay, thank you, Melissa. Thank you, Adair Turner, for introducing this very useful report. I think in this junction, when we are facing COP30, and when we see the difficulty, the U.S. administration withdraw from Paris Agreement, and some of a large company withdraw from their commitment for cutting the emission. we really need this kind of report to say that we emphasize the carbon market and carbon prices. I'd like to share with you some of observation and discussion. The first, in the recent several years, we see the two major intention. One, market and carbon price and related policies. Just like our report already tried to outline. Another intention is to doubt the price mechanism and to maybe overemphasize greenwashing phenomena. And they say that we should rely more on the awareness and the voluntary activity to cut the carbon emission. But after so many years, when we see that the corporate still have their own behavior pattern. I think it's good to return to emphasize the price mechanism. And the price mechanism try to provide the incentive mechanism which to make the corporate sector to those of non-profit entities to really measure their objective function and to trade off between their economic objective and the climate change, climate objectives. Another discussion is to say that when we see the seriousness of climate change, people may intend to believe that in this occasion, we may change the corporate behavior and their objective functions. But however, for so many years, we realize the corporate, they set up for economic reason. So it's difficult to see the substantial changes. What we need is to provide their signals, let them to coordinate economic objective and their obligation in terms of climate change. Another thing is that theoretically, we see this the carbon price should be equal to the marginal cost of global efforts to cut the carbon emission or to remove of CO2 emission. So it means we need global coordination, like this report emphasizes that the carbon price should, to some extent, gradually converge between the different carbon market. And another is that the revenue from carbon credit or carbon price is better to be used for dealing with climate change. That means to cut or to remove the emission, the CO2 from the atmosphere. Finally, I would like to comment to say that we see that quite too much worry about greenwashing. Surely the greenwashing is something that we have to deal with. But some of bad behavior is actually in the process of policy change, the system and the capacity building process. Let me say that one greenwashing is physical greenwashing. That means to create the fake data. So this, no matter you rely on carbon market, carbon price, or you not rely on that, you based on the voluntary activity, the fiscal greenwashing is always harmful. It's you know that we have to gradually solve that by the technical and the other measures. Another greenwashing is that the intention is try not to believe the market mechanism, especially in case that there are so many carbon markets in the globe, and different carbon market create a different price, and this price may create the opportunity to manipulate or to use carbon credit for some unreasonable purpose. So I think the way to deal that is to enhance international cooperation, to gradually and controllable ways to connect those carbon market. So to see that carbon price around the world could gradually converge among each other. And meanwhile, we see the importance to intensify this technical works for the measurement and the evaluation. I think the report have some good idea to deal with those difficult sectors and difficult issues, which we may move forward to substantially reduce the worrisome of greenwashing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Zhou. I will now turn it over to Maria Ramos, member of the G30 Working Group on Carbon Pricing and Markets. Ms. Ramos?
Thank you very much, Melissa, and thank you for the opportunity to share some policy recommendations and insights and some real-world examples, including those that I have gathered through my role at Standard Chartered, which has a strong presence in emerging markets and deep experience in carbon markets. Scaling carbon markets offers transformative benefits, as we know, and as we can see from the report we're launching today. And as our report states, setting the right price for carbon emissions delivers a clear economic signal, driving innovation and efficiency in hard-to-abate sectors, which emit approximately 10 gigatons of carbon dioxide annually. Project-based carbon markets, meanwhile, can allow private capital to be channeled to high-impact projects, particularly in emerging markets. In 2024, the value of voluntary carbon markets reached some $2.1 billion, which was a 10% increase from 2023, demonstrating the value and the potential to fund carbon reduction and removals and to support local communities. Emerging markets present large opportunities, but they struggle to meet financing needs, as you can see from our report and as you've heard from Adair and James and others. Only 14% of global finance flows to emerging markets, and we know that at least $1 trillion per year is needed to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement. So there's a significant funding gap. Countries like Brazil and Indonesia, amongst others, and in this case, both Brazil and Indonesia, are both rich in natural climate solutions, or NCSs. Both have the potential to create decarbonization projects like reforestation. Carbon markets provide critical income streams that make these projects viable. Funding more NCSs and helping close the funding gap is therefore an option. But this isn't just about funding nature. Carbon markets are a critical tool in solving complex issues around decarbonization. For example, the transition away from coal is complex and challenging in many emerging markets. There are over 5,000 coal-fired power plants in the Asia-Pacific region, a region where energy needs are growing. But climate commitments will not be met if all 5,000 coal-fired power plants remain in operation until their end of life. Carbon markets have the ability to make the decommissioning of these operations investable, such as through country platforms like Indonesia's Energy Transition Partnership. In South Africa, coal remains the primary source of energy, contributing more than 80% to the country's power generation. Energy security has become a challenge due to the aging of its CFPPs. The country's $8.5 billion Just Energy Transition Partnership Fund is helping to address the challenge of building out renewable energies opportunities to resolve the power shortages and to accelerate the phasing out of the CFPPs. We know, though, that given the developments in the last couple of months, particularly out of the US, that some of this is potentially under threat. Carbon markets can support the country's energy security and decarbonization plans. So there is a great opportunity and more to be done. We heard earlier, I think it was from James, in Singapore, what has the developments there and the opportunities that have been created. But the Monetary Authority of Singapore convened the Transition Credit Coalition, Traction, which develops transition credits, the transition credits framework, which can help accelerating the closure of coal-fired power plants while funding renewable energy projects. Standard Chartered is a contributor to these initiatives. So the role of the private sector is pivotal in scaling these efforts. The private sector brings essential capital and technical expertise to the partnerships and projects that need to succeed to ultimately bridge the funding gap to climate initiatives. This requires public and private efforts to work in sync, combining government, environmental, and sectoral policies with corporate action to mobilize capital. For example, this year, Standard Chartered announced an agreement to sell high-integrity forest protection carbon credits, working with the Brazilian government of the state of Acre, with a potential of 5 million credits coming to market in 2026. 72% of the funds generated will be allocated to indigenous and local communities. As the report concludes, with a globally coordinated carbon pricing of emissions, we should be able, while a globally coordinated carbon pricing of emissions should act as the primary driver for hard-to-abate sectors, scaling project-based carbon markets plays an important complementary role. There are two elements which are needed to scale up this. First is the high standards on integrity, and second, the operationalization of Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. Standards on integrity are coming, such as through the adoption of the Integrity Council for the voluntary carbon markets, the core carbon principles that ensure credits are additional, permanent, and verifiable, as well as the voluntary carbon markets integrity initiatives framework on the use of carbon credits. Article 6 operationalization is also underway, with the cooperative approaches endorsed at COP29 being a significant step forward towards a global carbon market. We need both the implementation of Article 6 and the development of domestic carbon market mechanisms to allow the project-based market to integrate within them. We hope that this new report, which we're launching today, can support further discussion on Article 6's implementation ahead of COP30. So let me conclude by saying that the report sets out a number of recommendations which would significantly help policymakers meet their climate commitments. Pricing and markets can align climate action with economic growth. The innovative tools and recommendations proposed in the report are a further step on the pathway to a just and inclusive transition. Thank you, and I hand back to you, Melissa.
Thank you very much, Ms. Ramos. We will now begin the Q&A portion of the webinar. Our first question is for Lord Turner. This is from Ilya Lingorsky. He's a Governor Council member at the Bulgarian National Bank. How do you see the role of the central banks evolving in relation to the development of carbon markets and pricing?
Well, that's actually quite a technical issue, and the answer may be that central banks per se, depending on the local institutional structure, may not play a fundamental role. I think it's clear that, for instance, securities regulators have to oversee the integrity of trading mechanisms in carbon trading, as they do in equities or bonds or anything else. And in some parts of the world, that may be aligned with the role of the central bank. In some others, it's completely separate. So there will be some central banks in the world where the remit of the central bank is very specifically focused on price stability, where I wouldn't necessarily see them playing a major role in the carbon pricing regime, which is really for the government, the fiscal authority, to set. What I think is very interesting in relation to the role of central banks is almost a separate thing in relation to the energy transition, which is whether they should use the power of their balance sheet and of their liquidity provision to favour a form of a decarbonisation mechanism. For instance, we're very interested to see last week a report that the MAS in Singapore is putting money into blended finance projects, which could be supporting, I mean, it could be supporting just all sorts of a decarbonisation project in Singapore or the region. It might also be playing a role in the development of some of the natural climate solutions about which Maria has spoken. So I think when we look around the world, we do see some central banks, and that includes the MAS. It certainly includes the PBOC in China, of which Governor Zhou was the former governor, where the central bank is willing to use its liquidity provision or use its balance sheet to support all sorts of energy transition relevant investment. You have other central banks who tend to say, no, look, let's be purist about this. Central banks are about financial stability and monetary stability, price stability, and therefore we don't get involved. But that is a philosophical decision where different central banks around the world are making different decisions.
Thank you very much, Lord Turner. Our second question is from James Chong. He's an associate at Singlife. As we approach net zero targets by 2050, what is the most viable pathway for carbon pricing to evolve? Will it remain a national or regional tool, or do you foresee the emergence of a global carbon benchmark price that integrates with capital markets?
Do you want me to answer that as well, Melissa? Yeah.
Sure, or if James
Shall
has
I say something on that and then hand over to James? Look,
sure.
I think the answer is, in an ideal world, we would see, as Zhou Xiaochuan said, a somewhat common converging carbon price emerging. That would be a good thing. And I am hopeful that we will, particularly in the sectors where it's most important, such as aviation and shipping. Having said that, I think there are some sectors of the economy where, after a while, carbon pricing will not be very important. I mean, I think it's very important to realize that in the power sector and in much of the world, in what we call the global sun belt, solar plus batteries is now a cheaper way to produce electricity round the clock than is fossil fuels. In which case, even if you don't have a carbon price in those sectors, you'll get a transition. Electric vehicles are going to be cheaper than internal combustion engines up front and cheaper to run, in which case people are going to buy them whether there is not is a carbon price. And that's why in this report, we say, look, don't get too worked up on there has to be a carbon price for every single sector of the economy. There are some sectors where the technological progress will take us towards net zero. Focus your attention on carbon pricing on those sectors where energy is a large percentage of total cost, where there is likely to be a green cost premium for production for a long period, and which are internationally traded. And that's the heavy industry and the long distance transport sectors of the economy. And in those, we can either see national carbon pricing mechanisms with CBAMs and then other people follow. But if we could speed the progress by getting some international agreement, as we are beginning to see in maritime, that would be very good. But I don't know whether James wants to focus or say something on how he sees that evolving in the markets and trading area.
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, I mean, I guess today we already see separate markets from a trading perspective. And I would say if you look at the project-based markets, they already are significantly global in this. A corporate buying a carbon credit today may well be buying one. In most instances, we'll be buying something from another market. And I think one thing that is important within the recommendations we talked about is a lot of the steps that are required to scale demand will ultimately need to be driven at the national level. For instance, when we talk about reputational incentives for companies, it's national regulators who are determining rules around emission reportings and transition plans or securities regulations in those countries. And those are the things that would need to change to give companies a significantly greater reputational benefit from buying a carbon credit. And likewise, when we talk about convergence with the compliance markets, again, those markets, particularly in the areas like power, are nationally driven, and the whole drive towards energy security is just reinforcing the extent to which those things are seen as important elements of national policy. So a lot of those steps that are needed to scale demand will be nationally driven, and we can't really wait for global progress. But of course, companies are global in their nature, and they will buy credits from all around the world. And we do need some coordination around the standards, particularly when we talk about things like project integrity.
Thank you very much. I have another question. This one is for James. Why should companies voluntarily buy carbon credits? With pressure on margins and profitability, shouldn't they return that money to shareholders?
Well, I think it's an important question, and I think it's one that lots of companies are wrestling with today. And that's really why we try to focus on this differentiated approach between those types of sectors who are relatively low emitting, like the technology sector, the professional services sector, the financial services sector, where they can potentially reap significant reputational benefits and be able to say, make claims relating to their overall emissions through purchasing removal credits as one separate category. And I think if you look at where a bulk of the demand has come from to date, it has been companies like Microsoft. I think we saw some sizable purchases from JP Morgan this year. It has been those types of companies who've been driving demand, but still penetration even within that sector is relatively low. So I think We are trying to be pragmatic in the recommendations we've put forward and think about, we can't impose crippling costs on companies. And that's why for the high emitting sectors, the link into the compliance market is very important. And of course, in those sectors, in many cases, companies are already being asked to pay to buy permits. And so we'll be repurposing that money and linking it into the project-based markets.
Thank you. I have a question specifically for Adair. How would you advise addressing the inequality where high-emitting nations and corporations can simply buy their way into compliance, while low and middle-income countries and communities cannot? How can we make sure lower-income countries who did the least to cause climate change do not suffer the worst effects and rising costs? And that's from Zhou Xiaochuan, economic statistician at the Eastern Caribbean Central Bank.
Well, look, there is obviously some crucial issues with climate justice, and broadly speaking, there are very big differences in the level of emissions per capita across the world. They are, of course, changing. You have to recognize that China is in an interesting situation now. It has significantly higher per capita emissions than, for instance, Europe does. So we tend sometimes to say we've got a model of who the high emitting are and the low emitting are, and 20 years later we assume it's the same. It is continually changing. So we have a number of countries in the world, America in particular, Europe, China in particular, which now account for a very significant proportion of the total. And we have at the other end another of low-income countries, I think in particular of Africa, where emissions per capita are below about 1 ton per capita. I mean, if I give you the figures, China is now order of magnitude 8 or 9 tons per capita. Europe is about 6. The UK is coming down to about 5, and Africa is below 1. So yes. It is the big emitters who should take the action first to get down emissions. I wouldn't personally focus all that much on corporates because, corporates ultimately are just pass-through mechanisms for individuals. And I think one aspect of a climate justice that we don't focus enough on is rich individuals wherever they are in the world. Right? I'm not convinced that a rich individual in India can claim that they don't have responsibility because they can, as it were, attach to their denominator a whole load of very poor people in Uttar Pradesh or Bihar and claim, oh, well, my emissions don't matter, even if they're as high as European emissions because they're averaged out. So I think we should focus a lot on individual emissions, which is why I'd love, for instance, to see a global aviation carbon tax, which would primarily be paid by the rich of the world, and which, according to the proposal which was put forward by President Ruto of Kenya last year, should be dedicated to climate finance. So look, it is a complicated thing. The existing process tries to capture that reality, which is that within the Paris framework, it's absolutely clear that the countries which are the bigger per capita emitters have got to take action first. Though I would throw in this, as it were, optimistic thought for some of the most low-income countries, which is they are about to be the beneficiary of a technological revolution that I don't think people have realized. And I mentioned it earlier. Solar has come down in price 95% in the last 15 years. So has batteries. As a result, solar plus batteries are now cheaper than fossil fuels in the whole of the global sunbelt to produce electricity. And that means that the cheapest places to produce electricity in future, round-the-clock electricity, are going to be Latin America, the Caribbean, Africa, India, Southeast Asia. They're not going to be Northwest Europe, Japan, or Korea. And that also means that the cheapest places to produce zero carbon iron and steel from for instance, green hydrogen are going to be those global sunbelt countries, not the wind belt countries, where electricity will be more expensive. So yes, those countries have contributed less to climate change in the past. Yes, it's not crucial. I mean, not crucial at all that Africa cuts its emissions because its emissions are so low. They're trivial compared with either China or the UK. But you shouldn't see all of this as a sort of sharing the cost. There's also a huge opportunity, and the opportunities are actually greatest in the global Sun Belt, which includes many of the world's poorest countries.
Thank you very much. We have time for one last question. This one is for James from Soon Gale, Deputy Director of the Monetary Authority of Singapore. How can secondary trading be scaled to ensure more efficiency pricing, price transparency of carbon credits?
Thank you. It's an important question. I mean, we talked about a few recommendations. Of course, we've already mentioned the importance of integrity and standards and establishing clear conventions around that. I think the other issue that we have is just the lack of end user demand. And I think obviously you're talking about secondary liquidity, but stronger primary demand will help in the first instance create that. And one of the specific areas we touched on was the convergence with the compliance markets. And again, I think one of the knock-on benefits of that is helping establish a reference price. If, for example, in the UK, we say, okay, here's a certain class of credit which we consider to be good enough to be linked into our compliance market, that's starting to give a clear signal to the market around a reference price. And most prices, from the interest rate market through to the oil market or any type of commodity market have a reference, which is then used to sort of ladder up and down in terms of quality, tenor, and all the other variations. And I think that in a way, the market would really benefit from some very clear guidance around this is the core that we can drive liquidity around, and then all the derivatives, etc., can be built off that. So those are a couple of suggestions we talked about within the report.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we've run out of time for more questions. We would like to thank all of you for taking the time to join us today.